super excited to welcome Scott back to SPC. Scott is obviously the co-founder and CEO of Cognition, and they're building amazing kind of like products. But Scott was also one of the first OG members of SPC, gosh, back in 2017, 2018. And so it's kind of like amazing to kind of welcome him back since then. And we can maybe get going and get right into it.
Awesome, let's do it. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be back here.
Feeling is mutual.
It's been a long time. It's like 7 years since I was at SBC.
Yeah, it's kind of like the same thing. Startup time is relativistic, which is it passes really fast in the moment, but then it also clearly like passes really slowly in the sense that there's a lot happening on a daily basis. So your mental model of it is kind of skewed. It's both fast and slow. But with that, Scott, why don't you tell us something that you value that you think is highly undervalued by the rest of the world?
So growing up, actually, I was super into math and programming competitions. So that was my whole background. I did like math contests, programming contests. I did the IOI, if you guys have heard of it. And so I think a lot of my framing has always been rooted in terms of math and these kinds of math puzzles is almost how I describe it. It's like even when we're going and doing a sale or something, or when we're figuring out product strategy, like in my head, it all actually like maps to just like doing math questions. So that's probably what I would answer. Yeah.
I mean, that's amazing. So do you think that, maybe to pull on that thread for a second, so do you think that that background in math is like you actually are taking a more analytical or mathematical approach even to things that are not traditionally thought of as math, like the probability of a sale going through, actually doing EV on a particular call and so on?
Yeah, doing EVs on calls and things like that. I mean, I kind of like, one trend that I've been thinking a lot about lately is I would almost describe it as like the Moneyballization of everything.
Yeah.
And so obviously Moneyball is the idea that, in sports over time, things have gotten way more analytical because you can figure out, here's the EV of your three-point shot, here's the EV of this play or that play, and basically analyze and break that down everywhere. I actually think the same is happening in startups as well. I think a lot of the personalities that people think of kind of, I'll say, the origin stories of Silicon Valley, these are obviously very talented technical folks, but they're also people who are very very raw and kind of very imaginative thinkers, like people like Steve Jobs or something like that, that really kind of captured the imagination. And I think over time, over the last few decades, I think that's actually shifted a lot more in the Moneyball direction of founders who are super analytical, who are breaking down each situation and kind of figuring out the optimal strategy, so to say.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think that you definitely are right that as a methodology, starting a company today feels a lot better understood than it did 20 years ago. And I think you can actually chart a much more optimal course through kind of like that exact kind of path, the dark forest of kind of startup, right?
Yeah. I think it's something that happens with a lot of fields as they start to get a little bit more, a little bit more mature and a little bit more fleshed out. I mean, my favorite example of this is poker, where like 30 years ago, you had people like, Daniel Negreanu, Phil Hellmuth, Scotty Wynn, and they were very raw personalities that just like had this intuitive feel for the game. And now it's like all the pros they're just math nerds,
It's true. I mean, but to kind of switch gears, but stay in the same vein, every once in a while you have a dude like Steph Curry who's basically shooting moonballs to kind of like win the Olympic gold, So it's kind of weird to Moneyball everything. Yeah. What do you think is your superpower?
I don't know that there's anything particularly special, but yeah, if I had to pick one thing, I would say, kind of the ability to just kind of like break down each situation into logical reasoning and to just kind of figure out how to apply principles of logic. I think there's a lot of spots in starting a company, especially where you're trying to do something that no one has ever done before, and so you can learn the playbooks and so on, but you always have to kind of just break things down from first principles and make your own decisions. So,
okay. By the way, all of these are founder fellowship interview questions. We are basically in the thick of founder fellowship interview season. So my first three questions are all questions that I've been asking in founder fellowship interviews. The next one is, what do you believe about the future that is heretical?
Oh, that's a fun one. Let's see. I think in AI, I'd say within our community, one thing which is probably first question that gets asked in every AI conversation is like, what's your AGI timeline? And my heretical view that I'll give is, I'm not sure that an AGI timeline actually really matters. And the reason I say that is because, there's obviously a lot of discussion about these practical capabilities of AI and like, what can this do in theory? Like what happens, when it solves this really hard math problem, which is obviously very, very cool stuff. But I think in practice, there's going to be, I think, a much smoother curve of, call it, AI adoption and actual widespread usage across the world. And a lot of the work that we're doing, obviously, is figuring out how to make AI actually useful for real-world use cases and change economies and change people's everyday lives. And I think, in some ways, it's almost obviously progress in AI is great, but it's almost a slightly different metric where you can have widespread adoption of AI, of generative AI out there in the world and not necessarily have AGI. You could also have a theoretical AGI and not necessarily have that widespread adoption. So that's kind of the thing that I always think more about.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, if you read a bunch of sci-fi, right? Like for me, thinking about AGI is basically akin to thinking about the singularity.
Yeah.
But in most sci-fi books, like as soon as you even get close to the event horizon of the singularity, you don't even know it because it happens like it kind of happens exponentially very quickly, kind of the last 30-40%. And so for me, it's like, hey, if we hit it, then great. Like we'll be an uploaded consciousness as kind of a society in the cloud. But anyways, moving on to the AI landscape. So you probably with Devin, I'd say that this was the first actual application of AI agents that really captured the imagination of a lot of us, right? It was the first time that we saw a demo and we're like, oh, I get it. So this is what, not just I think programming could look like, but also how agents could be applied, right? And in fact, I think after you guys launched Devin, I must have seen at least 5 or 6 companies come by and say, we're building the Devin of X, right? So in some ways, like, I think that, you are at the forefront of what it might mean to have like this AI first application company. What do you think is similar and what is different about having an AI company relative to all the companies you've seen over the last decade?
Yeah. I mean, well, thank you so much for the kind word. I mean, honestly, I really think we're actually still at the very, very beginning, and there's so much more to do and so much to build. But yeah, I mean, I think what's similar and what's different. I think a lot of the core principles of general company building are, of course, the same. Figuring out how to get a really rock star team. Obviously focusing on building something that people want. Figuring out how to distribute your product. Figuring out how to grow your product. And yeah, just being a good first principles thinker overall. A couple of things that are different. I think one thing I'd say is most companies in the past arguably have been powered by technological shifts of some sort. There was the whole consumer social era, there was the whole mobile era, right? There was the whole internet era, and those all gave rise to a lot of new businesses. I think AI is unique in that it's much more, I think, of a sequence of increasing steps than it is a single binary change. And I think there's a couple implications of that. The first thing, obviously, is you find yourself having to make way more involved technical decisions about what is actually possible or what will be possible, right? And so, I think it's one thing to think about, okay, people have phones now, they're probably going to have phones more and more, and like, what are the great products that we should build for people now that they're on their phones more? I think there's kind of a different mode in AI, right? Of like, here's the technology as it exists today, and it continues to get better and better, and like, here's our forecast for how it's going to change in the future. And all your decisions on product strategy, on how you work with customers, on even just the basic decisions that you make as a company, I think really leverage that. I think one consequence of that actually is that I think it's even better now than ever to be a very technical founder, because not only is the product that you're building technical, but all of the decisions that you're making are obviously heavily technical as well.
That's well said. So let's pull on that thread for a second. So if I understood you correctly, what you're saying is that relative to, let's say, building a classic like cloud SaaS company 5 years ago, the underlying technology was well understood and maybe not static, but it wasn't completely changing as you were kind of building the company. And I think what I'm hearing from you is that building an AI company today, means that you have to, in some ways, make convicted bets on where the technology might be 12, 8, 24, 36 months from now, and actually work backwards in a way that we haven't had to do as an industry.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so you're right. I think with a lot of these other waves, you could kind of see the progression of what was going to happen, right? There was going to be way more adoption of cloud. There was going to be, way more people with access to the internet, like things like that. But the core technology, I think, while it's not perfectly static, is at least relatively predictable. Whereas here, it's you're making a pretty concrete bet about what is happening in technology and where the state of the art would be.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of wild, right? Because I've been in the industry for 20 years myself, and you're right that every successive kind of platform shift or kind of technological enablement has still happened a lot slower than it has in the AI world, right? Like to kind of just use a reference point, ChatGPT was still only like 20 months old, right?
It's been a fun 20 months, yeah.
Yeah, it's been a fun 20 months, and even since then, we have seen successive generations of these foundation models, like hundreds, if not thousands, of companies enter the fray. So stuff is just moving a lot quicker. Yeah. So I guess, if you're running a company, while there's all of this changing, how do you both remain, in some ways, like convicted to your vision, but almost be dynamic with the ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, I think I personally, I think one of the most important things to do as a founder is to be very honest with yourself, actually, about like what's working and what's not. I think there's kind of a trope, almost, I guess, of a founder having this like unbridled optimism about what's going on, which I think is true. You need to have optimism about the long term, but I think it's almost the opposite, where you actually have to be really paranoid in the short term. And I think in AI, that's especially true because, you kind of should just expect that there will be surprises, and pretty big surprises as well, with how fast everyone in the industry is moving, right? I mean, even if it's your space, it's like, this is happening in hardware, this is happening in robotics, this is happening in foundation models. Every other field is making progress just as fast, right? And because of that, it's very easy for the ground to move under you.
Right.
And so, I think there's a lot of just being ready to challenge your own assumptions and, being ready to move quickly. I mean, I think the big advantage that startups have is their ability to adapt and move quickly. And so you really have to take advantage of it.
So maybe to drill into one part of that. So how would you kind of describe your 6 to 12 month outlook for the kind of like the frontier kind of like foundation models, right? Because even relative to call it like 8 months ago, 8 months ago, everybody was really just obsessed with the OpenAI, frankly, like the GPT-4 models. But today it feels as though that between Llama and Anthropic in particular, their models just feel like as good. And so it feels as though there's been a market shift even over the last 8 months. But what do you feel like? Do you think that we are entering a commodity kind of like phase in terms of having 3 or 4 models that are roughly equivalent? Maybe they have their own specialized, tuned, use cases. They're all kind of excel at a couple of different things. But how do you see that ecosystem playing out?
Yeah. I mean, commodity is almost a bit of a loaded word. I feel.
Yeah,
I think
I don't love that word myself.
Yeah. So I guess in my mind, the closest comparison, actually, I'd say is like the clouds today, where Amazon and Google and Microsoft, obviously, are kind of these big clouds. And in a few ways, first of all, there's a ton of CapEx, and I think these companies are putting more and more money into these base models, right? These generalized base models. There's huge economies to scale. There's also a lot of benefit from just really optimizing things, and a lot of meaningful edge by which you differentiate. And I think you kind of end up with this kind of equilibrium where there's a few players, and by few I mean 2, 3, 4, 5, something in that range, right? And yeah, they're offering this, but at the same time, the reason I guess I wouldn't say commodity in that sense is, clouds are the best businesses in the world.
They're a commodity,
right?
in the sense that they're all multi-$100 billion businesses with 50% plus gross margin.
Yeah.
It's a great fucking commodity.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think it kind of ends up with something like this, where there are these kind of massive platform companies that will do very well, and then there will be lots and lots of applications that can be built on the platform on top of it.
So maybe staying in that same vein, what is your take on how far, what is the scaling frontier for kind of these
Yeah.
state-of-the-art models. Yeah.
Yeah. So I realized you had another question about the 6 to 12 months, kind of like the forward-looking. Yeah, I mean, so there's still more juice in the scaling laws, and so I think that will continue.
Thank God.
For sure. And yeah, I mean, I think there's now unprecedented amounts of capital being put in, which is amazing. You know, a few kind of broad areas I would say. You know, one is reasoning. In particular, I think is making a ton of progress, and a lot of these labs are putting real focused effort into that. You know, I think the I mean, I think the initial kind of launch of ChatGPT, you know, the main amazing thing was the ability to talk like a human, right? And I think now we're seeing a lot of them that essentially have the ability to think and evaluate options like a human as well, which is, I think, a pretty massive change. Obviously, there was an announcement of, you know, getting a silver medal on the IMO with AI, for example, and there's a lot of other progress that's happening.
How did that make you feel, Scott?
Oh, it was amazing, dude.
Okay.
I mean, it's like 10 years ago, I mean, it was like my whole life. It was like the only thing that I cared about was basically, you know, getting the highest place and everything. And it's like, yeah, I mean, the pace is...
Like, so, I mean, did you look at that achievement? And because, you know, I kind of took a look at the solutions. I'm like, I'm not a mathematician. So, I mean, I guess it looks cool.
Yeah.
But like, from your vantage point, did it feel like a seminal kind of achievement?
Yeah, no. So I tried those problems as well.
Okay.
And it was, yeah, they're pretty hard. I would say it's truly incredible stuff. One thing I would mention is Google did it with these with full formal techniques, right? Using a programming language called Lean, which basically allows you to write formal math proofs. I think there's a lot of interesting progress that's being done with informal techniques as well. And you know, the natural thing with informal techniques, presumably, is that you get this much more generalizable reasoning ability where you can think and talk in plain English and actually apply logic. But no, it was truly incredible. Yeah.
Awesome. So before we kind of move on into software engineering and AI in particular, one last question about the AI landscape and just about your tips here. How would you kind of had the public release of the last, again, 6 to 8 months, right? So what tips would you give to people? A lot of the folks in the audience are building AI kind of companies. How do you nail kind of like an amazing release of like an AI kind of product?
Yeah, I mean, it was. It's hard to say that it was intentional, to be honest. I mean, I think it's kind of funny because we were preparing for this launch. You know, we had there was a Bloomberg article and they interviewed us and everything, and it was like planned to go out. And then that weekend, we actually just scrapped our whole video and then like started over, and we were like, you know, actually we don't like this. Let's try something else. And so the article was supposed to go out on Tuesday at 6 a.m. We actually weren't done like filming the video as of like 1 a.m. on Tuesday, like that night. So we were basically like up all night. We asked them to like push the article if they could do it a little bit later, and then they ended up giving us 9 a.m. instead of 6 a.m., which we actually needed those 3 hours. But yeah, no, it was a lot of last minute work, basically like doing putting up the blog post, doing the video, showing all the example runs of Devin, and it was a very, very last minute setup. I mean, I think the main piece of advice I have probably is to just like think about what makes your own company and own products like really unique. Like the thing that we didn't like about our previous video is that it's, you know, you could imagine other products, you know, or other companies having a video that looked very similar. Whereas, you know, I think what came out in the end was us basically just like showing what the product looked like and what it was like in action, and then just talking it through, which I think turned out to be better, even though it was obviously much less formatted.
So the meta feedback I'm taking away is that always throw away your shit, you know, like 6 hours before launch, and just like do it live. Just do it live. Yeah, okay. I love it. Moving on to AI and kind of the future of kind of software engineering, I think that it's pretty clear that, you know, AI is going to fundamentally remake a lot of industries, but it is definitely going to change like the way software engineering is done. And there's a lot of, I would say, excitement and optimism for the amount of code that we will be able to write, but there's also a lot of fear, right?
Yeah.
Like, what does it mean for, you know, the jobs that a lot of us have done? Like, are they changing? Do they not go away? Like, how do they morph, right? So just curious if you could talk a little bit about from your vantage point, What does the future of like kind of software engineering look like?
Yeah, yeah. And so I mean, this is great because we use Devon all the time when we're building Devon naturally, right? And so like Devon has built a lot of the a lot of the front end for us, like a lot of the API integrations, a lot of our own like dashboards and like tracking. All of this were built by Devon. But I think it actually like yeah, I mean, it's been interesting to see how our own workflow has changed, and I totally agree. There's a lot of excitement and also a lot of fear. I think one thing that is maybe under-recognized is just how much more code there is to write, is how I put it. Like, I think at a high level, over the last 40 years or something, software has been kind of the major driver of progress in the world, right? And we've been basically putting more and more and more things into code. And this is despite having way fewer engineers than we've had demand for basically at all times ever, right? Like every company has 30 projects that their team wants to do, and then they have to pick 4, And it's just like, I mean, there's just so much more to build. And even I think beyond that, like there's so much kind of even like, I'll call it single use software that would make sense if the economics worked out for it. And by that, what I mean is like, even if you're just saying like, okay, today I'm going to go click through all these LinkedIn profiles and look at this, and then, I'm going to go like set this thing up and I'm going to go order this or whatever. All of those things, they can be done with code. At some point, they're probably more efficient to be done with code, but obviously it's not worth the money to be paying somebody to go and write all the code to do this for something that will only run for your specific use case. And so, I think because of all these reasons, I kind of think like the demand for code overall is like more than like 10x the supply, and even more than that. And I think the other thing too is like, we feel this all the time when we're using Devon. Like, Devon's not going to tell you what to build, and Devon's not going to make those decisions. And so I think what actually ends up happening is, first of all, I think there's actually going to be way more software engineers, not fewer. Just like when we went from assembly to C to Python or something, there were more engineers, not fewer. But also, I think the kind of job or like what we'll be doing as engineers day to day, I think is going to change a little bit, where it'll almost be more like being like a halfway between a PM and a technical architect, right? Like you're handed a problem and you're really breaking it down and figuring out, what do I need to build? What are the details and the edge cases and all the flows, and what exactly is the solution that I'm trying to make for this, right? And once you can describe that very precisely, you hand that over, and the agent builds it all for you. But I think the net result of that is you just get to build way more stuff, which is a pretty awesome result. So
yeah, it's kind of wild to me, how we treat code as this like super precious thing right now. It's like, wow, you have this code, and before it goes into production, make sure at least 3 humans look at it, right? And like everybody makes sure that this super precious thing is correct. And then once it's out into production, again, it's treated as like this thing you have to like coddle and kind of make sure it's doing well and it's healthy. And I'm just like, why don't we just write a fuckload of code and throw it away? It's because it's too expensive right now, right?
Yeah.
And I think that I personally think that the amount of code that humanity wants to write is 2 orders of magnitude more than like what we can produce today. And I hope there's a world where we just like all of us can crank out a ton of code and hopefully throw away 99% of it. It doesn't need CI, CD, it doesn't need maintenance. Like you don't like the first version of code that's generated, generate 10 more, right? Like maybe one of those works, right? And you just can't do that today, no matter how good an engineer you are. And I think that'll change in the future.
Yeah. And I think this step, will be probably like a bigger step than some of the others. But I honestly keep thinking back to some of these other, you could imagine going to somebody who was programming with like punch cards, in like the 1950s or something, and like show them what we do today with Python. And they would already basically say, wow, you could just tell the computer in English like what you want and then it happens. I think that that is kind of the trajectory of code, over time. And I think we're going to make it easier and easier.
Amazing. So, since again for the Devon launch, we have now had, God knows, I mean, there's so many companies that are taking some approach towards code gen, right? Or to generally to either make, having co-pilot approaches or kind of agent approaches. So how do you think about this landscape? And obviously it's a crowded landscape. Like how do you kind of navigate your way through the dark forest here?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think it's honestly great. I mean, there's a lot of work to do in code, and there's a lot of people doing awesome stuff. I mean, it's great to just see how many people now are really recognizing how much more potential there is in the space, which is awesome. I think our view from the beginning has always been that, I would almost describe it as, for the last 2 years or 3 years, there's been this wave of chatbot style products, right? Where you basically feed in a prefix to the model, and the model produces the suffix of text, right? And you go from that and you build products based off of that. And I would say kind of the whole wave of products in all the different industries was essentially that, right? I mean, ChatGPT itself is obviously like that. There's a lot of Q&A type products. There's marketing copy, customer support, GitHub Copilot, which is a great product. These are all basically that, right? You take a prefix and you just kind of get the suffix that it prints out. And it makes sense because obviously that's the interface of a language model natively, right? But I think if you think about like the problems that we solve and the problems that we work on as humans, I think over time, there's a ton of value in not just a chatbot, obviously, but an actual decision maker, right? Having a legal assistant that you can talk to is cool, but like, what about if you just had a lawyer? And so the same thing is happening in a lot of these spots, and so that was why we were so excited about building agents from the beginning. And in general, we really just think that there's going to be this new wave of autonomous decision makers, and that's what I think sets Devin apart.
I mean, how do you view code versus like actions? Like if I had to ask kind of the more like abstract version of the problem, like, or do you think it's just code gen all the way down as we kind of figure out how to get these AI systems to, in some ways, kind of like be able to reason their way through things? Or do you think there's also a no-code version of this AI? Like, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so Devin, for example, is able to browse the web, is able to run commands, is able to store secrets. And so because of all those things, and it obviously is able to plan and make decisions and kind of optimize for multi-step processes. And because of that, actually, it turns out that there are a lot of these kind of use cases that aren't code use cases at all that people often ask Devin to do. Like, hey, can you just go to this website and like go and Google each of these people's names from the conference list and tell me a little bit about them so that I come in prepared? Or, hey, can you like, here's my here's my credit card. Can you go and like put in this order on Amazon for me? I mean, it's cool to see. It's not what we focus on. Like, we're entirely focused on software. But I do think at a high level, a lot of it closely relates to, can you solve this planning and reasoning and multi-step decision making, and can you provide the tools where you can interact with the world and do that? So
I'm going to ask the question that, you kind of opened this box. I'm going to ask the question. I mean, do you think in the process of building Devin, are you finding out kind of more generalizable approaches to some of the things that you said, planning, reasoning, sequencing, coordination, and so on?
Yeah, I think there's, I mean, globally, I think logic is logic, right? Fair. And so, I think being able to reason and plan and execute plans, I think in one area often does generalize quite well, especially if the tools that you're using to do that are actually the same tools. And so, yeah. I mean, we've seen a lot of kind of general gains, and maybe kind of a simple example is like making Devin better at using its browser and making decisions around that actually improves its ability to make decisions around, testing or debugging or whatever else as well. So
interesting. No, I mean that makes sense. It would be self-referentially consistent. Yeah. I mean, what about, there's been a bunch of open source kind of approaches as well to, I think, building out some of the similar functionality to Devin, and some of the OS approaches are kind of doing well in SweBench. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's great to see. I mean, it's honestly amazing to see a lot of others kind of working in the space as well. I think there's a lot to do to actually kind of make a product that actually goes out there and works for real world use cases. That's the kind of the main thing that I would say. And so, with our customers, for example, like a lot of the natural things that Devin needs to do for them is stuff like, connecting to their Datadog to read their logs and to debug live, learning their code base over time and being able to kind of deal with different things that come up, being able to run the development environment locally and being able to test the front end itself and stuff like that. And so all of these are, I think there's probably more work to do towards kind of like better benchmarks, public benchmarks in the space towards that. Like for ourselves, for example, like we primarily use our own kind of set of evals when we're testing things out and trying out different things. But I mean, it's great to see.
Makes sense. A couple of questions on maybe the future of AI kind of like architecture. Um, what does memory look like for these agent systems, like in particular, like long context, like how much does that end up affecting the efficacy of the models today, or how does that evolve in the future and so on?
Yeah. So I mean, I think context is going to get longer, obviously, which is pretty exciting. I do think still that there's practical constraints, right? And so like thinking kind of like and figuring out directly how to solve this memory problem is still going to be important as context gets longer. I don't think we'll have a world too soon where you, as some people say, where you just kind of shove the entire code base and the history of everything that ever happened in the context, and then the model decides what to do. But yeah. I mean, I think this is actually one area where it's interesting to think about how humans think. Because I would say humans actually have very short context windows, right? I mean, it's like when you get like the verification code, like the 6 digits, like it's actually kind of hard. If there were like 10 digits, like I'm not sure, And so I mean, we obviously have I think it's about 15 seconds of memory, right? But I think what humans have is probably in our AI terms is probably closest to describe as like a really beautiful retrieval system where you pull up some file and you're like, oh yeah, I remember this. I worked on this like 3 months ago, and then like suddenly you just kind of remember the details of that, right? And so I don't think the capabilities of AI will like necessarily track humans exactly, but the main thing I would say is like it is pretty clear that the problem solving is certainly possible without having to get into millions or billions of tokens of context. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, yeah, I was just thinking like, you're right, like humans have incredible recall.
Yeah.
In terms of being able to recall like certain things that does not depend on kind of the context window, and able to kind of like essentially cope. Yeah, interesting. Okay. In future AI systems, how much of like today planning is really done outside of the model, right? It's kind of like layered on as kind of a system that is interacting with the model, but kind of just done outside of the model, right? So do you think do you think that these planning constructs and capabilities will make their way into kind of like models, or is that just not even a well-formed question because we don't actually know how these models are doing anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think right. I would say I think the barrier there is not so concrete. I would almost describe it as, in general, there's pre-training, post-training, and inference time of models. And honestly, there's a ton of optimization to be done at all three layers for most of the use cases that we care about still. And many of those kind of spill over into each other. And so,
okay,
yeah.
Okay, cool. I'm gonna maybe switch over to ask some general questions on early stage entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
And then we'll kind of switch over to audience questions. This is kind of like the second company that you have started. The first one was Lunch Club. Probably the hardest question that every entrepreneur kind of faces is like, when do you know that it's time to kind of give up? Especially given that so much of our mythology in Silicon Valley is kind of about persistence and kind of like dedication and kind of long-term thinking. Like, how do you know, like, when, like, hey, actually, this journey is done, and I kind of need to go to the next thing?
Yeah. I think there's a really great PG essay actually about like determined but not stubborn, which I really like. I think a lot of it comes down to, what we're saying, where it's you need to be a long-term optimist, but you also in the day-to-day need to be very paranoid, right? And at each point in time, you need to think about like, what is the story of how it's going to go from this to being a massive success. And you're either going to come out of it with, okay, there is a path, but here are the things that I need to make sure are going to need to happen if we're going to make that happen. And then you have your priorities for what you're going to do today, right? Or it's a question of like, is this thesis that we had still true, or is this still the best thing, right? And so I don't think there's ever an easy answer, but I do think a lot of it is. I feel like people are often told almost that they have to kind of drink their own Kool-Aid, and like believe things for the sake of believing. And I think that, again, there's a place for optimism, but I do think that like a lot of doing startups is about really just being honest with yourself.
Okay. if you could have one kind of like, real talk, hard truth that you could tell to a founder, what would you tell them?
There's certainly a lot of pieces of conventional wisdom out there. I mean, I think one that comes to mind is build something that people want. It's very easy to proxy a lot of different things. Like growing a team, or having this and that, like number of people who tried your product, or having whatever. When really the one thing that you're really trying to get at is just building something that people want. I think another thing too is like not being afraid to look dumb. Like you're gonna have to do things that are very different and very new, and just be kind of willing to do that. Like I can think of like all sorts of. I mean, there's one fun example for us. Like we interviewed a candidate who was a student at MIT, and he did like incredibly well on the interviews. And so we were talking to him about joining, obviously, and it was a tough question for him because he was in school. He was figuring things out. And basically he got to the point where he's like, this is the most exciting problem, and this is like what I want to work on, and I'm in. But like, I'm not sure this is going to work out because I don't think my parents would be okay with that. And he's like a nice Gujarati family, and everything. And so what we did is actually so two of us we flew to North Carolina. We had dinner with his parents. Gave them some gifts, talked a bunch about like what we're doing and why we think it's important, and how amazing their son was at all of this, and then we literally we got to the airport, we drove to their house, had dinner, we were there for like 2 or 3 hours, we drove back, we flew back that night, and it was like, I mean, the ROI on spending that 8 hours of time was like unimaginably high, and I think there's definitely some feeling of like, like this is going to feel really dumb if like, it doesn't make a difference anyway. And honestly, in a lot of cases, maybe it wouldn't have, but it's the kind of thing where it's like, yeah, I mean, if we just sit here and think about it, like, what are the chances that this does something meaningful, and what do we get out of this? And like, the math at some point is all there. And so.
I mean, the anecdotes I can tell about recruiting people. I mean, I remember this one from Dropbox where there was this guy who was maybe like had 2 semesters left at Cornell maybe, and then I was convincing him to drop out, and then I get a call from his mom, and she was like, promise me that my son will finish college. I'm like, well, how am I supposed to promise that? She's like, well, you have to. I'm like, fuck it, I'll just promise. And then when Dropbox closed to the IPO, his mom called me back. She's like, I think my son should get a degree. Can you help him out? I'm like, well, he's kind of made a bunch of money. He'll be fine. She's like, no, he should get the degree. So we enrolled him for kind of like evening and night courses, and he eventually ended up getting his degree. Like, you gotta, do not mess around with Gujarati moms, just saying. Ruchi is also Gujarati, just to be clear. But maybe with that, we can kind of turn it over to the audience. I think we have a bunch of cool questions. We have some folks in the front here who I know have been working on AI foundation models, but let's start. Anybody want to start with a question? I saw that gentleman was quick to the draw. Yes, you're right, over there in the green sweater.
I had a question about like, how did you find product market fit, or how are you going about it? Because one is the sentiment that like software engineering is going to change, so you're obviously going to get defense from the people who are already doing the job, and your customers will find it very hard to find consensus and like actually deploy it at scale. So what are some challenges finding product market fit with Devin?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, I think for us, one of the natural things, obviously, we all love coding and everything, and so it's great for us to use our own product. I think the first exciting use case, like where like Devin really worked, was in the very beginning. We were like trying to set up MongoDB for something, and it was like it was tough to figure out. There was just like, it's the kind of thing where you run into one error, and then you go and like Google that error, and you fix that, then you run into another error. And it's like it's just, as far as I know, at least, it's just how DevOps
just play
goes.
Whack-a-mole until something just is up and running.
Yeah. And so we gave it to Devin. At the time, Devin was basically just a prototype, and so we didn't really expect anything. We're just like, hey, can you set up MongoDB? Because like we can't right now, and like it did, and that was like one of the like really exciting moments because it was like actually something that we needed, where it worked. And I think for us, yeah, I mean, I think iterating with customers and also being customers ourselves is kind of like one of the most important things. You know, I would say like the problem that we work on, if anything, is maybe more researchy almost than most. But I think even despite that, obviously, like software engineering in the real world is messy. You know, we have to know that it actually works for use cases that people care about and things like that. I think as far as like engineers being defensive, you know, I think we've been lucky for the most part to not really have had that. One thing I would say is like the use cases that we work with our customers on today, honestly, in general, are the more kind of tedious or repetitive use cases. And so one of the nice things about it is, first of all, AI is better at it because it's, you know, it's this repetitive thing. You're doing a code migration or you're doing like a replatforming or something. And, you know, it's a big code base. You have like 5,000 files that you want to migrate over. You know, it's very tedious in a way that AI can do quite well. But the other thing too is like, no engineer wants to do this anyway, you know? And I think it's a good example of like the nice duality of human plus machine as an archetype. Like the truth is there really is so much more out there that people would do. You know, why do people lag on migrations and version numbers and whatever else in the first place? Well, it's because it's kind of painful to do, right? And even just keeping software up to date or being able to do the kind of migrations that you want, it's nice to be able to just work with customers and be able to kind of work on real use cases. So,
For sure.
Piggybacking on that, how are you dealing with sales and selling an AI technology? Like, who are you speaking to primarily, and how do you think about budgets and other things? Because I know there's a lot of people are like, we got to get AI in there somehow. Where are you going for that budget? Are you going for a dev tool budget? Kind of how are you thinking about that part of the process? And if you're not there, that's fine.
Yeah. I think for us, it's an interesting one because, yeah, as you're saying, there's a lot of appetite, I think, from execs who want to be on top of the new waves of AI, but then there's also, you know, there's a lot of developers who just like would love to try out Devin and mess around with the new tech, right? And so for us, it's typically been, you know, we'll go into orgs and basically we'll look for both top-down and bottom-up support and work with those. I think I mean, naturally, you know, there's innovation budget or general tech budget or dev tools budget. That honestly varies a lot from place to place, but I think when there's enough excitement about it and there's clear use cases that really work, I think that's kind of like what makes a difference. And I would say this in general, like, you know, having like, you know, sold other products before as well and things like that. I mean, I think there's a real difference definitely between like having to like fight tooth and nail for every single like little thing versus like talking with the customer and it's like, yeah, the use case works. Like let's try it today. You know, let's buy it today. I think a lot of it for us has been, yeah, like really focusing on the areas that Devin works for today and just continuing to like grow those and scale those. So,
is there a frontier right now of where like there are clear places where Devin doesn't work that you kind of like shy away from, which is like, hey, the technology isn't ready for it yet?
Yeah.
You know, yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think if you just ask Devin, like, all right, I need you to build this whole ass system and like, you know, complex architecture and everything, like, I don't think Devin would get that on the first try, you know, and Devin might spin around for several hours trying to make it work, but not get there. And so, yeah, I mean, with a lot of this, it is about kind of like figuring out the right cases where something is repeatable enough and clear enough that it's really that the ROI is really there. And for that, it's kind of, yeah, I mean, we've seen a lot of different, you know, migrations is a big one, like I mentioned, but yeah, various like front-end issues, you know, triaging logs or debugging sessions or things like that. The kinds of things where you have like a tight feedback loop, right, naturally. Like Devin would love to be able to make a change and then pull up the local front end itself and test the change, right? And that makes the loop easier.
Interesting. Okay. Akshay?
Yeah, so I wanted to know how you think about like investing in tuning versus like just like building the systems around the models themselves. So you can kind of like go into like the RL territory, right? Like build your own RL systems and like tune the open source models, but that could also like end up in wasted ROI because newer frontier models come out and the open source models might not be as good. So what do you think about that?
Cool. Yeah, I can't share anything, unfortunately, about how Devin works exactly, but I think at a high level, what I can say is Sure. So there's obviously, you know, investment that is, I'll call it like model specific investment that you could do. But honestly, I find that a lot of this investment ends up generalizing pretty well, right? I mean, a lot of the work, for example, you're talking about RL, like if you wanted to create a particular data set that captures exactly like what is the desired behavior that you want or something, you know, that's, of course, you might have to redo that fine tune or whatever it is on some other model, but like that data set itself is obviously quite useful and is going to generalize pretty well. And so I think in general, like one of the big things for preparing for the ground to move under you is just making sure you're investing in things that are transferable. Yeah.
A quick one on fundraising and valuation. So how do you think about the fundraising that you have done and like 2 billion valuation that is there today? How would you meet it? Because as a founder, I feel that that's too much of a valuation. Like it's a target on the back. Like what's your thought on that?
Yeah, so I honestly think like, I think the most important thing for us is to be very clear that we are still very early on, honestly. And I think about it as, you know, we're very early on, but we're going after a very big goal, right? I mean, how much is software worth, you know, as a category, right? And it's obviously quite a bit. And so I think in terms of like valuations and things like that, I mean, we have a lot more that we want to do and a lot more that we want to grow, and we have plans to get there. And so I think I think the bigger thing is kind of thinking of it in the context of where we want to be in, you know, a year or a couple of years.
Go big, I guess. You've been raising it.
So talking about stuff that you think Devin can't do, have you thought about sort of like an AI plus human symbiosis where it's like, okay, you sell Devin and then 60% of the tasks can be done by Devin, but then 30% or 40% that can't be done, you have an actual human do them so that there's a, you know, quicker iterative loop. Plus it's like a Wizard of Oz method learning about more tasks that need to be done.
Yeah. So we don't currently. We've been accused of doing that, I guess, but no, I think I do think there's a lot of value in being very integrated software, and what I mean by that is like it's often part of the developer's flow. Like there's a lot of little context or little knowledge that the developer themselves like needs to know when they do it. And so what we have really invested in is figuring out a lot of these UX problems for how do you actually interact with Devin, how do you give feedback, how do you see what Devin's working on. I honestly think that in general for agents, not just coding agents, but like all like autonomous decision makers, I think UX is super, super underdeveloped. I think even the basic things of like, all right, here's Devin's browser, here's Devin's shell. You can have a conversation with Devin. You can talk to Devin async while Devin is working on something. Like a lot of these are I think kind of like natural first steps, but I think there's more and more to build and do. And so I think the thing that we typically solve for is having the engineer get to use Devin and then give feedback and work with that, which is a very common flow. Often like you'll be running multiple Devins at once, you know, and you'll spin each of them up and they'll ask questions if they get stuck or something, but you kind of go and check in and work. You're basically like a manager of your own team of, you know, Devin interns.
Hey, Scott, thanks for your time. How are you all thinking about the second order effects of just so much of code being written through LLMs, right? I mean, I personally also use ChatGPT and Gemini, and many times I don't want to, but I still blindly copy paste code. And then as an engineer, I also am aware of things like bad smell. So of course, there's this tight feedback loop between something that compiles and doesn't compile, but there's also stuff that people just know that, you know, a senior dev would tell a junior dev that that's just bad code smell, don't do that. So if the internet is proliferated with like okay-ish code or something, or like a sort of a loop of like bad code being just going there and training models with like more bad code, like are y'all considering these things at all right now? Is this like a problem of tomorrow? Just want to, because as programmers yourselves, I'm sure y'all are particular about your craft, right? So how do you think about that?
Yeah, for sure. And so, you know, Devin makes PRs in our GitHub repo, for example, but, you know, there's a human who reviews the PR and gets it merged. I actually think one thing that's kind of interesting is like, the ownership mentality, basically. And so making sure there is like one human still on the Git blame for the commit, so that like, if there's something wrong with the code, that it still goes to them. I think that actually helps a lot. But yeah, no, I mean, I think in general, totally agree that more and more code is being written this way. I actually think in the long run, that'll be a positive, not a negative. Like, I think things will be written in the same kind of like idiomatic style, for example, and it'll be almost, it's like, you don't even have to look at the code because you'll be thinking about it in terms of like, what is the logic of what's being executed here? And you can make edits to the logic or something, and that will result in the right code change being written, so.
Yeah, I mean, I'd also push that like this idea of a particular style of like good code. I think these are artifacts of like a highly scarce resource that you want to have at a particular quality level, that today the downstream effects of like having bad code and fixing it and kind of, all of that is pretty high. But I think in the future, I mean, and also today we don't tend to have a very nuanced sense of like, what is truly code that needs to be treated like that versus code that frankly can be like, write once and then throw away. And I think in the future, there'll be like hopefully multiple tiers of code, and most code hopefully is just like, you don't actually care that much about like, it's kind of like how it actually like is implemented. It can be a lot dirtier. You can kind of throw it away. This probably says more about me as an engineer than it does about the future of coding. But I do think that today, a lot of our emotional attachment to how we think about code is actually the second order effect of how hard it is to write code, and in a way that actually will be hopefully, I think, radically different, like, a decade from now. Yeah, Scott's a much better engineer than me, so he's kind of looking at me, he's like,
No, I agree. I agree.
Like, most of my code no longer exists. So, okay, next question. Yeah. Sure, you are very. Oh, is it because I keep on looking that way? Okay, all right, yeah.
Can you share some experience of how you approach finding the right founders or co-founders, and how you recruit the right talents early on?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, it was like, most of the founding team, we've all known each other for like 10 years or something. And I mean, my two co-founders, like Steven, like, I've known him since high school or something, and Walden, like, as well. It's just quite a long time. We had similar backgrounds, like doing competitions together. We've all like spent the last several years like building different things in AI, and then it was kind of natural to work together. I do think like, with kind of initial team, as much as possible, I think it's great to work with people that you know directly, or at least like have a very, very strong like mutual connection with. I think there's, of course, a time where that has to branch out and you have to go beyond that. But I personally think that for the founding team, that's great to do whenever possible.
Finn, please.
One of the things you mentioned earlier is you've actually used Devin to build Devin. I'm curious, what was, when dogfooding your product, one surprising thing or unexpected thing that you learned? And then maybe what was something else that you actually you thought was true about the product that maybe you had to unlearn when you actually started getting it into the hands of customers?
Yeah. No, I mean, lots of little surprises in how Devin goes about and does things. I think even like, figuring out how to debug things like a human. It's like, it's fun to watch Devin. It's often very relatable, Devin will go and like read this thing and then pull up the other file and then like add some print statements and run the code again, and it still doesn't work. And then look in the logs and like, it's just like, an engineer after my own heart. But yeah, as far as things that change with customers, definitely a lot. Obviously, like working on a startup code base and everything is different from, especially from working on like big enterprises. I think the scale and just the pure size of like some of these big projects of like, moving thousands of files over to this thing. There's simple things where it's like, one customer we were talking about like migrating to Flutter, for example. And there's just like a lot of things where you basically need to put the little like question mark thing where it's like, if it's that, then you do this. And it's like, it's the kind of thing that's obviously, it's almost brain dead, I would say, but you have to do it like thousands of times. And just kind of understanding that that's where a lot of use cases were, and that's where a lot of people honestly are spending engineering time. And solving for that has been a big one.
It's brain dead until it causes brain damage when you miss one of those, you know. Couple more questions, maybe one more question from the crowd. Finn, your pick.
Hey, thank you. Thank you for your take on how software engineers' roles will change. I'm a designer turned founder. Would love your take on how designers' roles would change in the age of Devin. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that like, maybe one hot take. I think designers, engineers, and PMs, you know, for example, like a lot of the different roles within the kind of larger product org. I think what makes someone really great actually is like pretty similar across all those roles, and I think that core thing is the main thing that will survive on even as the tools change, you know. And if I had to describe it, it'd be something like, yeah, the ability to really just like break down a problem and think through what is the appropriate solution for it, right? And so like thinking about what are we trying to solve for here, what are we optimizing, you know, understanding like the different tools that you have available and then being able to produce the right solution. I imagine that'll happen everywhere. I think practically, I'm sure there will be lots of, you know, ideas of like taking designs and building full code based off designs only, for example. I think there will be a lot of tools that speed up the design process itself and like taking elements or themes and making full mocks out of those. But yeah, I think there'll be this kind of general trend.
You know, I'd also say that I really like the way that you said that great PMs, designers, and engineers have a lot more in common than they kind of like necessarily are different. One thing I would add is they kind of tend to understand at a pretty intuitive level like the limitations of the current system, but also how best to harness it. So my question here is, are you finding superstar like Deviners, like people who understand how to leverage Devin in like crazy ways?
Honestly, it takes a long time I think to get really accustomed to using Devin. This is one of the things that we're working on, like improving. But yeah, I think it is a very different. I think the way I'd put it is like people have experience, obviously, working with other humans. People also have experience at this point. They have some experience talking to chatbots. But yeah, obviously, working with an agent is kind of different from either of those two. I think the context thing that we talked about is one great example. I think being able to like parallelize and like spin up multiple Devins is another great example. I think some of the particular strengths and weaknesses. And yeah, I mean, we've found that it takes quite a bit of time, I think, to like really understand like, you know, what level of granularity that you need to break a problem down to for Devin, for example, or yeah, how exactly to prompt Devin and give kind of the right input that you need. So.
Okay. Cool. Couple more questions and we'll wrap up here from me. What are some books that have meaningfully changed the trajectory of your life?
Of my life? Oh, wow. I mean, I would imagine probably like math and algorithms textbooks have probably done more for my life than any. But no, recently, I mean, I think I've really enjoyed just like reading, you know, other historical stories about founders and people in tech. One book that I liked recently was The Power Law by Sebastian Mallaby, which was, yeah, I mean, it was about basically the whole tech ecosystem and a lot of the big waves that have kind of passed over the last, you know, 70 or so years since the founding of venture capital and venture tech businesses. So, yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, I have not read that. So, and I think I mean, maybe the last thing is, what is the most fun thing that you have made using Devin? Like, you're not obviously hacking on Devin itself or the company, but have you been using it for personal projects? What have you been hacking on?
Yeah, lots of little things. I mean, made a nice Valentine's Day website with Devin, which really saved me. I think that was quite good. I mean, I think. Not even. I mean, my co-founder Walden had a fun one where he like his flight got rescheduled or something, and then he like got the new flight and everything, and he just said, "Hey, Devin, here's my confirmation number and everything. Can you go and like give me like an extra refund or something on this flight?" And so then Devin went and took that and went to the website. It was like United or something. He was going on the website and like sending messages to the customer support thing saying like, oh, like, you know, I need to get a refund for this thing or something. And, you know, that's just like some, customer support like automated thing as well. Right?
Maybe
So-
also a chatbot.
yeah. So well, it was some kind of chatbot thing. It was responding, and then at some point, it wasn't really making progress. And so then Devin wrote in the chat, it was like, okay, I need to speak with the human. Actually, this is difficult. And so Devin got on the chat with the human, and then was like pointing to particular things from the legal terms of like, oh, section 25, you got to do this, and then actually got the refund. So that was a fun one.
I mean, wow. Okay. Amazing. Well, Scott, thank you so much for the time and
Thank you so much for
candid
having me.
answers.
Yeah.
That was super fun. Thank you all. This is Scott.